Today we are talking about transgender identities in Islam. And since this conversation today is theologically based, I suppose it would be important to find out if there's a prophetic example that we can work from. So the first question to you, Imam Muhsin, is, did transgender people exist in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? And if so, how did he relate to them?
So I think this is a very important question to start with, since a lot of Muslims assume that transgenderism is a contemporary phenomena, and it's often conflated with homosexuality. The former being about gender identity and the latter being about sexual orientation. And although there may be overlaps between the two, they're quite distinct, and therefore we have to separate them in our discussions. Now, the closest comparison that we can make to contemporary transgenderism would be this mixed-gendered and sexually diverse community that existed in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And they were called the Muhannathun. They actually had a name. Now, this community was very visible and socially involved at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And perhaps there are parallels that we can draw between transgenderism today and that community. At the time when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, arrived in Medina, they were already a visible community, and they were also visible after the Prophet passed away during the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties. Now, we must remember that Medina was a very cosmopolitan society with diverse religions and diverse cultures. And it's interesting to note how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, strategy was and his attitude was towards this diversity. It was always one of inclusion. And so yet at the time, he was not afraid to address beliefs and attitudes and behaviors that were detrimental to the proper functioning of society. So in some instances, we find the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, defending them. And then in other instances, he would take action against them if there was any inappropriate behavior on the part of any of the Muhannathun. For example, there's this one hadith recorded in Sunan Abu Dawud about this particular Muhannath who was clearly transgender in her appearance, and she was brought in front of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for questioning. So the Prophet Muhammad asked, "Ma bala hada?" What is the problem with this one? And they replied, "Yatashabbahu bin nisa," that he's imitating women. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, banished him to An-Naqim, which was just on the outskirts of Medina, so it was not very far. But the people were not satisfied with this, and they asked the Prophet, "Should we not kill him?" And then the Prophet said, "No, I was forbidden to kill those who pray," because he recognized her from the mosque. Now you can imagine that this conversation could not have been this brief. The hadith probably only captures the gist of the conversation. Neither does this hadith present the full picture. So in terms of the milieu and the mood of the conversation, we can't read that in that short piece of hadith. So on surface level, it might seem that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, objected to this Muhannath's behavior, which could have possibly been the case somehow. But on the contrary, according to the research of Dr. Everett Rosen, he found that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was actually protecting this Muhannath. And that's why he sent this Muhannath outside of Medina, because he feared that Muhannath might be torn to go molested if the Muhannath should stay on in Medina. So what may seem like a banishment was to the onlookers, and perhaps to Abu Hurairah also, who narrated this hadith, was actually the Prophet protecting this Muhammad. So this can only mean that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was aware of the vulnerability of these Muhannathun, and hence we also see later that the Prophet Muhammad allowed this Muhannath to come back into Medina to fulfill her daily needs. And maybe also see that the Muhannathun used to work in the houses of the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He had no objection to them working in the houses. They were often, confidants to these women. And their gender identity was never a problem to the Prophet, peace be upon him. But one day, this particular Muhannath was describing the bodily features of a woman. So, in that case, objectifying this woman. And so the Prophet thought that he might be pretending to be a Muhannath. And so hence the Prophet said, I see that he knows these things, referring to the sensuality and the sexuality of a woman's body. So he could have possibly been an imposter, or he could have been bisexual. So he was a threat to the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so the Prophet wasn't against this Muhannath based on his sexual orientation, but the kind of behavior that he was displaying. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was not against the Muhannathun who naturally displayed characteristics of women, but he was against those who imitated women and those who pretended to be Muhannathun and who used their disposition for personal or for monetary